All right, welcome back, everyone. This is Hermit Radio. I'm your host, Cameron, and this is round two with Peter Bolland, philosophy and humanities professor. Peter, thanks for being back. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Cameron. It's an honor to be back here on Hermit Radio. Love it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your candor and I appreciate your character. And today we're going to be talking about philosophy. And the first thing I want to talk about is this idea. I have lots of conversation, as you might imagine, with a podcast. And I find that people are in one of two categories: people who believe in something divine, and that is their existence, and that is their drive for being a good person or doing good things. But then there are people who are on the other side of that argument who say that religion and spirituality is sometimes a hindrance to the development of goodness because of things like the Crusades and religious dogma. And I kind of wanted to break that down. And I've listened to lots of different philosophy podcasts that get into this. And it's like, what is meaning? What is it? What is it to be divine? And is it necessary?
Oh my goodness, we are going right into the abyss here. These are the great questions of philosophy. Meaning, the word meaning, let's just start there. To me, that's a very interesting word. There's a very famous line in one of the Bill Moyers, Joseph Campbell videos, where Bill Moyers is kind of pressing Joseph Campbell on this question, like, what is the meaning of life? And Campbell's, I think, sort of glib response is that, what's the meaning of a flea? What's the meaning of a flower? He says the mind has to do with meanings. What people really want, Campbell argues, is not meaning, but the experience of being alive. And so that's an interesting starting point for me, because these are videos from the late 80s, right? So I've been thinking about that for a while, and it's a whole series called The Power of Myth. And that is an interesting assertion that when we pull back, and as we often do in philosophy, in fact, this is a criticism of philosophy, isn't it, that all they do there is talk about the definitions of words. Well, I get it, but if you're going to ask for the meaning of life, it's not a bad task to first define the word meaning. And what is it we really want? Because I get it. The question focuses on a hunger. People have a longing to come out of confusion, to come out of alienation and fragmentation and into coherence and wholeness and integrity and healing. And in fact, that's what the word philosophy means, right? The love of wisdom. And it's not an intellectual pursuit at the primal level. It's a soul longing for connection. And in fact, isn't that what the word religion also means, from religio, meaning to connect together, to link back together? So people turn to religion or philosophy because they want to come back to their being comfortable in their own skin, and being comfortable with one another, and being comfortable in the cosmos. Maybe comfortable is the wrong word, but some kind of serenity in the face of the anxiety. So the second part of your question about religion, some people are going to gravitate toward explanations that involve deities or ancient ritual systems like Roman Catholicism or devotional Hinduism. And for other people who might call themselves atheists or agnostic, that seems a little bit off. And they want to have that same impulse, right, to come out of chaos and into order, but they're going to do it without deities or without those kinds of what they would call mythological components. And so maybe those two positions, the atheist and the theist, maybe they're not as far apart as they think they are.
Yeah, I really appreciate your opinion on that. And I love this topic, even though in my mind, I'm constantly arguing with, well, not so much these days. These days, I feel like I have a pretty solid ground to stand on, but I can see the trouble, right? And the trouble is always in this, right?
Yeah.
The mind, right? Which
Yeah.
is why I so strongly resonate with the Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Zen and Taoism, mainly because it's not so much about a deity, right? It's not, I mean, there is the Buddha, but the Buddha is not a god. The Buddha is somebody that has the answers that we're looking for, which is, you could argue a Christ-like figure or a Muhammad figure. And you think about these characters, right? And this is something that goes into psychology, which is that these people are characters in a story that have archetypes.
Yeah.
And when you think about Buddhism particularly, why do they have statues of the Buddha everywhere, right? It's a reminder. It's not for you to worship Buddha. Or well, maybe in some ways it is, but in other ways, it's a reminder. When you see this figure, it is supposed to help you remember who you would like to be, which is a kinder, gentler, awakened person. And I just really love that. And then sometimes I wonder, like, maybe we could have that same opinion about like Christ. Whenever we see a statue of Christ, it's not so much to worship this statue of Christ, but it is to remember what it means to be this character, to be this archetype, to be this good person. And what I struggle with Christianity particularly is that it is a religion of conundrums. It says, be like Christ, but you'll never be like Christ. And I find that troubling because how could anybody really want to fulfill that task when it's already being set up for failure, whether they realize it or not?
That's an interesting way to frame it. It's aspirational, isn't it? It's like, here's
Yes.
the goal. It's like when you give, your daughter or your son a guitar when they're
Mm,
8. And it's not like if you don't turn into Jimi Hendrix, it's all a waste of time. I mean, you wouldn't put it like that, right? You would just say, hey man, here, let me show you some songs and let's jam. And it's a pleasure to learn. It's a pleasure to grow. It's a pleasure to come out of ignorance into wisdom in
mm.
anything. I'm using the guitar analogy, but
That's a great one.
you see what I'm saying. I think we misunderstand each other, meaning all of humanity misunderstands each
Hmm.
other. People who are somewhat outside of Christianity or maybe antagonistic to it for good reasons. Eh, this is a discussion I've had so many times with some of my atheist college students who are usually from Catholic families, and they're usually pissed off and they're
Yes.
usually angry about the Inquisition and the conquest and all of it, and pedophile priests and the whole thing. There's this laundry list of reasons to be mad at Catholicism, the institution. And I'm not here to defend any of that, but I think people outside Christianity look at it and they see a bunch of people in a room praying to this Jesus hanging on a cross, and they think, oh man, what a bunch of sheep. They just need an authority to show them how to be and so on. But what if it's different? What if inside of that church, whether it's Protestant, Christian, or Catholic, any kind of Christianity, what if those people are doing something different? What if they're, as you suggested with your comment on statues of the Buddha, what if they're simply trying to come into relationship with ultimacy?
Mm.
And they're not there to be sheep at all. What they want is that relation. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, talks about the I and it relationship and the I thou relationship.
Mm.
And when we have an I it relationship with everything, everything's just an object. It's But when we shift into the consciousness of I thou, when I see you as in that Hindu sense of namaste, right? When I see
Yes.
you as the presence of the ground of being, then I have a shot at experiencing myself as the ground of being. So what if Christians are doing that when they go to mass or when they go to a revival? They're just looking for a way of not turning God into a bunch of concepts and ideological doctrines, but they're looking for that gut kind of juicy level experience that transcends all conceptual thought, the mystery of the cross. Of course, it's paradoxical.
Mhm.
Why would God need to become human to go through a sacrificial death to repair the sin from Adam and Eve, since God created the snake and the apple? It's all a mess. And so
Yes.
when you're 13 and you experiment with atheism, you're like, it's all garbage. It all doesn't make any sense. It all contradicts itself. Look at these Renaissance paintings. Adam and Eve have navels. I've actually seen that meme on Facebook, right? They have navels, and like, think about it. It's like, yeah, you're right. They didn't come out of the womb of a woman. So why do they have belly buttons?
Fair
And that's
enough.
your atheist triumph, that argument.
Yeah. Well, I'll do you one better, and this is a little bit more controversial, but are you familiar with the Nag Hammadi? Have you done any reading or extensively on that?
I know what that is. That's a library, a collection of scrolls of a bunch of extra biblical scriptures. Yes.
Yeah. One of them, which is my favorite, is the Secret Book of John.
Mm,
And it's a very long thing, so I'm going to summarize it the best that I can.
right.
But it's a fascinating take on some of these stories in the Bible that most people would have no clue of. And one of them being is that the Secret Book of John is a conversation with John and Jesus, but it's after Jesus is already gone. And John is lost in his ways, and he's kind of forgotten what he was supposed to be doing. And so Jesus appears to him as a body of light and basically retells the story of Genesis. But it's a very different story of Genesis. And again, this is a Gnostic text. So it's, again, it's riddled with occultic kind of hidden messages, names within names. But what I find fascinating about that is that it's like we look at those stories and it's in it, we wonder, at least for me, I wonder why, like, why are these stories not accepted, but other stories are? And some people
Right.
argue it's because of time, like when they were written, possibly, or when they were discovered. But my point is that that goes on. There's lots of stories like that. There's lots of different scriptures, and they paint Jesus, these Gnostic ones, anyways, they paint Jesus in a very different picture. And the last time you were on the podcast, we did talk about the parallels between Jesus and almost Hindu or Buddhist quasi, beliefs, or at least painting in that picture.
Yeah.
And the reason I still love that so much is because I think that somewhere in the middle of all of that, we could find a place where everybody could have something to take away from. And really, pause that spot here. My buddy, a friend of mine who's a very, very smart man, but has no religious or spiritual tendencies whatsoever. We were having a discussion about virtues, and he says, and his belief is about the Greek philosophers, particularly Aristotle. And he wants to say that what we need in this society is we need virtues to live by, and that would fix the problems in our society. And I said, well, that's great. But if you don't have anything to stand on for those virtues, then why do them? What's the motivation for anybody to do those good things? If, in religion, it's about either pleasing God or not offending God, or attaining something, ascension, enlightenment, or whatever that is. There's a ground to stand on. Whether that's right or wrong, there's a ground to stand on to want to actually perform or pursue these virtues. Otherwise, it's really just about character development, and not everybody wants to do that. And so to get to that point is, I think that this mix of the Western ideology and the Eastern ideology, there is a place where you don't need to have a deity, but you could still have a ground where we, almost like Taoism, we see everybody the same. And that is our reason for continuing these virtues. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good way to put it. To me, it's a very sort of, forgive me if this sounds judgy, but it's a kind of low level spirituality to be a
Yeah.
good person, to please a deity, or to even lower, to avoid punishment.
Yes.
Because then your whole cosmos is just self-interest. Well,
It's not genuine.
right. I'm going to be good because I don't want to burn in a lake of fire for eternity. That's
Yes.
not goodness. That's just naked self-interest.
Yes.
So again, perhaps there's a disconnect here. I think that the Greeks are a good touchstone here, and I'm talking about 5th century Athens, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, because Plato said that virtue is its own reward.
Mm.
And his student Aristotle takes that further. And the reason we want to be virtuous, and I'm not speaking for your friend, but I recognize that line of reasoning, and I like it, that the reason I want to be, and let's list some of the Greek virtues, compassion or friendliness, courage, just those two. The reason I want to be friendly and kind, and the reason I want to cultivate courage, is not to please anybody else. It's to, in Aristotle's writings, it's to reach my highest potential, and
Yes.
to live in accord with my own nature. And this is my goal. The goal of an acorn is to become an oak tree.
Mm.
I have a, you're not supposed to take these from Sequoia National Forest, but this is a Sequoia pine cone, right? So this little tiny thing has seeds in it that will become one of the largest living things on Earth. And so it has within it the a goal, in the Greek word is t telos. And so the telos of this acorn is to become a giant, of this cone is to become a giant sequoia. So what's the goal within us? And for Aristotle, our inner goal or entelechy is to become a fully realized version of ourselves, to take all of our
Yeah.
potentialities to their highest fruition. And this is the longing, you know. And there's that Afghan saying, what a shame it is to die like a pomegranate
Mm.
with all of one's seeds still locked up inside. And that the best life is the life of risk, the life of experimentation, the life of courage. That's the only way you'll ever be friendly or compassionate, is by cultivating courage. And so the reward is eudaimonia, which usually is translated as happiness, but it really means that deep satisfaction that only comes from living fully and well and courageously and lovingly.
Mm.
And so you're right, there's a whole portrait of human potential that is utterly removed from any idea of pleasing a deity.
Yeah, that was amazing. I think that that is really truly at the heart of, I mean, this conversation. But so, and now let's shift gears a little bit. So, and this is where my point comes into play, right? Like, I agree with what you said 100%. And that's why like, and I agreed with what you said there about, like, well, if you're only trying to be virtuous, if you're only trying to develop, right, to please God or to not offend God, you're right. That's not genuine. That's been my argument for a long time. I don't think that that is the right, I don't know if the right way is the correct thing to say here, but it's not genuine. Okay. And so, because it's not genuine, wouldn't it be more genuine if you use that godly given free will to just do it? That to me seems the highest aspiration that you could achieve. And so now the question is, in today's society, why, and maybe I'm not seeing this correctly, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of that happening.
Hmm.
And arguably, we can say that lots of things have been going on in the last decade. And I think that people are not so focused on their virtues as they are focused on their anger and their distrust of other people, and maybe not knowing their place in the world, right? And maybe we could, I don't know, I don't think confusion's the right word, but I don't know, maybe you've got a better word than me, but it just seems like people are angry right now, and today is not about attaining the highest virtue. Today is just trying to survive.
I get the same impression, and I know we all do. And this is a many-headed hydra. Is that the mythological analogy I'm
Yes.
going for here? There's a lot going on in this impression. Let's acknowledge that first. And I share your perception that that's how it seems. Um, but we don't have the capacity to talk to hundreds of millions of people.
Mm.
We get social media glimmers of anger, and as we've all learned about Facebook and other social media algorithms this last year, anger gets more shares than joy. As the saying goes in news or in journalism, we don't cover when planes land,
Mm.
we only cover when planes crash. And so every day, hundreds of millions of planes take off and land successfully. But when one explodes and kills a bunch of people, that's the imagery we all live with for the next 48-hour news cycle. Most 15-year-olds do not murder people at their school. But when they do, it nauseates us and shakes us to the core. And how can you not despair in the
Yes.
face of that kind of horror? and then get on social media and make all kinds of grandiose proclamations from all kinds of ideological stances, and the anger just goes up and up and up and up and up. So I'm not blaming the media, the social media, for that, but it's not helping. and
Certainly.
and so my solace here is looking back at Confucius, looking back at Buddha, looking back at Socrates. They all made the same observation about their own time, that people were shallow, mostly
Yes.
selfish, interested in material wealth, and not in the cultivation of their souls. You hear Socrates. Well, actually, it's Plato who's writing all this, right? You hear Plato lamenting about his own time, fourth century, fifth century Athens, as a time of decline, and people only seem to care about money and power. I mean, it sounds just like now.
It does.
And so I turn to voices like that to keep me from tipping into total despair. And I have this weird job, right? I go to a community college here, Southwestern College, and I teach philosophy and world religions and world mythology to 19 to 24-year-olds. And you know what happens every year? I get a year older, and they keep making more 19-year-olds, and they show up in my rooms, well, on Zoom the last year and a half. And these kids, they were born after 9/11. They have as much experience of 9/11 as I have of the Civil War. And so they have a whole new set of contexts and challenges and art forms. And I've been watching the Beatles Get Back thing on Disney, the Peter Jackson 8-hour documentary. It's just incredible, and it just reminds me that I was 10 years old then, and it looks like it's from the 1800s. I mean, the clothes and everything, and I just realized I'm from a different world than my 19-year-old students are. They grew up in a world of whatever their pop music was. So my point with all that rambling is that the kids are all right, and the human soul is perennial, and it springs ever new into new contexts. There's always been horror, there's always been ignorance, there's always been institutional savagery, and there's just as much to celebrate now as there is to lament. I think politically we're in a lot of trouble, and there are things happening today that we've really never seen before, and so that is cause for deep concern. But I'll be damned, it's like every year the grass grows up out of the fallow fields, and the deer give birth to new fawns, and the ice melts, and the springs start to flow, and we water our crops, and somehow it's just things get a little bit better. The headline I read today in the paper was that the monarch butterflies are back in California. Monarch butterflies migrate up from Mexico along the California coast to places like Monterey and Santa Cruz. And the last couple of years, they almost disappeared, and everybody freaked out. Well, this year they're back in staggering numbers. Nobody can explain it. It's like nature has this weird resilience. I'm not saying we have to make drastic changes because of human-caused environmental destruction. We do. But, in many ways we have. A lot of my neighbors, we have solar panels on our roof. We're slowly disconnecting ourselves from fossil fuel. A lot of people have EVs and hybrid cars in their garages. It's happening. And who knows where we'll be in 50 years, but it's almost like the only thing I can do philosophically is shape my thoughts about the world. I can't really change everything about the world. I can just change the actions that I'm taking.
Yeah, you can change the way it's a perception issue, and I struggle with that often. Like you said, and I'm glad you brought up the media, because and this is what I try to honestly, I talk to people. I do a live stream on TikTok all the time, and I really try to ask challenging questions and bring up very touchy topics, because just like the philosophers of ancient Greece, the only way to resolve these things is to talk about them, to converse and debate them. Yeah. And through that, we identify truth, we identify what can be notably facts, right? Or if there's something that is fact that isn't, we can correct it. But if we don't do that, we're left to our devices. And I think that that's a problem. And so, one of the things I was talking to people about is, we see things that happen in our government, in either world governments, right? And then the question is, when things don't go the way that we think it should, right? And a good example is, like, let's look at like Jeffrey Epstein, right? My wife and I just watched a documentary on him, and he obviously got that sweetheart deal. And so a lot of people were like, wow, is the system rigged? And the question is, was it rigged intentionally, or was it just a byproduct of the system? And if it was a byproduct of the system, is the system inherently corrupt? And what I try to talk to people about this is that there tends to be this one side or the other kind of situation where it's like, there are people who are like, no, it was just, it was just the way it is, and it's not a big deal. Like, he got a deal, lots of people get it. And then you got the whole other crazy side of the argument, which is, wrapped up sometimes in conspiracy theories. And it's like, no, he was in this satanic cult of pedophiles and doing it.
Right,
It's
right.
like, okay, I'm willing to hear you on this, but let's talk about this. Do you really think that that is the problem? Or is what happened a product of a flawed system? Is there somewhere in the middle we can meet? Yes, he was connected to other people. Does that mean that they're in a satanic cult and, doing whatever it is that they're doing? I I don't know. My stance is always, I say I don't know because I don't really know, but we can talk
Right,
about it.
right.
And I think that that one thing we could wrap up into very many different topics that have been going on in the last like 5, 6 years.
Exactly. Conspiracy theories are intellectually lazy. That's just where I always land. You're basically taking the absence of clarity, the absence of knowledge, the absence of information, and just fictionally backfilling it with whatever the heck you want. And it, as it often is revealed, people who peddle conspiracy theories are con men, and they're interested in self-aggrandizement and or increasing wealth. Sidney Powell, for example, one of Trump's lawyers, the most one of the most prominent voices in the election was stolen narrative, stop the steal. She made $14 million. There's an article today about this. She made $14 million with her nonprofit. So she cashed in on that lie, even though she backpedaled it. And when she was brought into court numerous times, she just said, well, everybody can see that what I was saying was obviously false. So therefore I'm not really, lying. And what a weird defense, right? This is someone who is
Yeah.
an attorney making this case. So I'm just picking on one little example there. There's examples of that kind of thing on all sides of the political spectrum. But I think that's again, a critical thinking problem when you have a very large number of people looking for the explanation. And this is something, I hate to do it. I hate to bring up the Nazis, but Hermann Goebbels, Adolf Hitler's minister of propaganda.
Yes.
And he learned this from the Romans, really, the Roman emperors. The rules of propaganda is people will believe a big lie more readily than a small lie. That's interesting.
Yes.
And that the way you make people believe the big lie is just you just repeat it endlessly. You say it over and over and over and over and over and over. And whether you believe it or not is irrelevant. So what angers me about all this is that powerful people who have been given power misuse that power for their own ends at the expense of this great country and these amazing American citizens who just want the truth and they just want fairness. And they get used by their leaders. And that's the part that I have the most difficulty stomaching, because I am a patriot and I'm a son of an immigrant who flew an American flag on the front of his house, my dad, every day of his life. And I believe in what this country can be. And I hate to see it dragged through the mud like this. And I know this isn't a political show, but when you talk about philosophy and truth and meaning, it's in all of our faces every day that something is dreadfully wrong on an epistemological level, meaning, what is knowledge versus what is opinion. And that's why, guys like you and me in our work, we're always interested in discussing that question, because you're right. It does come from having those sometimes difficult, honest conversations. I hate to mention Get Back again, the Beatles film I just saw,
Mm,
but one of the beautiful things about it is, and I read a kind of a think piece by a psychologist about it, and her argument was amazing, that what that film does is it gives you a front row seat on a really healthy workplace conflict resolution process. You know, Paul and George and John and Ringo were going through, you know, it was the end of the Beatles. They were all insanely wealthy, living in their own mansions with their big Rolls Royces, and they hadn't performed or made an album in a few years, and they didn't know who they were anymore. And George was sick of it, and they fought like hell. And you sit there for 8 hours through some really difficult sometimes discussions between them, but you know what? They stuck with it. They kept talking. They told each other the truth. They shared their feelings. They admitted where they had made mistakes. They defended each other in surprising ways. You could see that underneath the surface, there was love, and they loved and were grateful for the Beatles and for each other. And so there's a model for how any community, even the entire United States of America, can come together around our shared love of what is possible, and our bedrock humanness. And that's a universal truth, isn't it?
yeah. No, and I really appreciate that view. Um, you know, and for me, like I grew up in the 90s. I'm a 90s kid.
Yeah.
In the 90s, conspiracy theories were innocent and playful. You know, it was like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot and UFOs. Um, and then, you know, in the last 10 years, things really took a turn. And, you know, I hear these things and I'm like, wow, this is really dark. You know, it's really strange how that evolved to that. And now we're in a place where conspiracy theories are very taboo and people who talk about them are taboo. And I don't know that that is proper because it's people. And again, it's forms of discussion. But the problem is not being able to have a level of discernment, right? It's not being able to, like, you can talk, but are you able to listen? Because if somebody's telling you, hey, if you believe this, there's this list of things you should probably investigate to make sure that what you believe is actually true. And where I struggle with, and I was in the military for a long time, and you know, I experienced things where the truth of things were not displayed to the public. There were things that happened when I was in Afghanistan that American people don't know about. And so when I hear people who have a distrust for the government, I understand, but I think that it's been taken advantage of by certain people, like you were talking about earlier. And then my devil's advocate moment is to think about people like the Cuomo brothers, right?
Yeah.
How it's hard to have, you know, those are people we're supposed to have trust in. Those are people, head figures, and or even Ted Cruz, right? These are
Right.
people that we're supposed to have our trust and faith in, and they fall short, right? We talked about this on the last podcast. They're sinning, they're falling short of their best selves.
Yeah.
And so then, you know, how can their constituents have trust in people? And that's where I feel like the argument is painful for a lot of people, um, because it comes down to a level of distrust. And then when you don't trust people, it becomes easier to believe these sometimes wild other ideologies. Um, and then what that takes me to is what we've been talking about, which is this idea that we have to communicate with each other. We have to debate, because if we don't do that, then we'll be left to our own devices. And then these wild things will develop and bloom. And I think that today where we are is that we have a hard time communicating. I think we're in a hard place to be able to talk to people because um, we don't want to. Like, here's an example. I worked with somebody, and obviously I'm not going to use their name, but we were talking, and I was kind of just trying to develop a conversation. They said, honestly, I don't really like talking to people anymore because I don't want to find out they're Republican. And I was like, damn, like
Wow.
I get it, but how can you learn? How can you evolve? How can, maybe there's something that we need to learn from each other. And if you can't talk to people because of your fear or distaste for that, I just feel like that closes the gap and that leaves no room for intellectual discourse.
There's no doubt that people are exhausted, they're just tired. And so there's room for people to just sort of retreat.
Mm,
And I feel that happening um, sort of, after the last 5 years. There's a kind of level of exhaustion, especially given the recent Supreme Court rulings regarding the abortion battle and so on. There's a sense of defeatism that the war has been won, and people are just I'm just going to go back to my house and live my life now. And that's that's understandable. But how to get people to keep having those conversations. It starts with storytelling.
mm,
Instead of asking what party are you or who'd you vote for or whatever, it's like, let's find that spot. I know this is corny and we've been hearing it our whole life, but finding that one piece of common ground, that empathy, and just telling a story that reveals something about you, that reveals sort of your bedrock faith in humanity, then they can kind of connect to that. And that's a powerful opener to beginning to rebuild. The fact is, people do come back from hate groups. People do come back from horrific conspiracy theories. I know the news likes to go down to Dallas, and those people that are too extreme for QAnon, that are meeting on the grassy knoll, that are waiting for the resurrection of JFK or whatever the heck they're doing, and those people are too crazy for QAnon even, right? And so there's always that gradient scale out to the edge of madness. But you're right that conspiracy theories used to be more innocent, and something shifted. I think maybe it started around 9/11, when right
yeah.
away the inside job stuff started coming up. And then in the Obama and Trump eras, it became birtherism. And so conspiracy theories that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, therefore he was an illegitimate president, that what in the old days would have been a fringy theory, that went mainstream.
Mm,
And that theory brought Donald Trump all of our consciousness as a political figure. And so now, it's not funny anymore. Now white
mm,
supremacy and white supremacists have inhabited these theories, and some of them, and use them to again raise their brand. And then you get to Charlottesville and all the rest. So it's not as innocent as it used to be. And now people are concerned about confronting some of these things. And then what does that look like? And how do you bring people back? And I don't have any of those answers. It's really vexing.
I know, and that's really that's where I'm at. Is I really I wish I had answers, and that's why I have these conversations, because I'm hoping that through discourse we will find something.
Yeah,
Um, when I talk to people, even I find myself avoiding certain topics.
that's right. Me too.
And I hate that because it never used to be
Right.
that way. I've never in my life found myself in this place of confusion. And, honestly, I don't really feel at home anymore. I feel like um, and I hope this doesn't sound controversial to say this, but being a straight white man, I kind of feel out of place now. And I kind of feel like I've become a target at times when it's like I go back on my life and I think about, like, all right, how was I raised? And I do see things. I do see things that people talk about, these, racist tendencies that we grew up with. Certainly. Without naming names and dropping dimes, you know what I mean?
Of course, of course.
Definitely growing up, I heard these things, but as a kid, it never really impacted me. I didn't grow up. I grew up in Oregon. So like, I didn't really grow up around like kind of like in the South now. My wife and I were talking about it. She said that she grew up in a time where the KKK would come up and like walk through the streets, and you just stayed in the doors and you didn't go out when they did that.
Right.
That's mind blowing to me. I never
Yeah.
experienced anything like that, but I see where it comes from. And being a student of history, I can see the map. I just got done
Of course.
re-going over the Civil War, and
Mhm.
it's a shame. And I really wish I had some kind of answers to fixing this, and I think really that there is no fixing it. I think that it's kind of like it's a matter of where things going to land. I think that what we're seeing is nature is taking its course, and I think that we just have to move through this time, um and we'll be better for it. I mean, that's the whole process of evolution. I think what we're seeing is a great unraveling of things that have always kind of been in place.
Sure.
And hopefully it's for the best. I think it is, but I think that that's what's happening, and that there's not any one person or any ideology that's going to fix it. I think that we just have to get through this particularly difficult time,
That's
and
right.
all of these ideas, these quasi revolutions and these things,
Mhm.
they're going to take place, just like they have in the past, whether it was the American Revolution, the French Revolution.
Right.
um it's just like that. It's just not necessarily through armed conflict, even though at times it can.
Yeah, it can break out. Look, you're absolutely right.
It's more of a cultural, right?
Yeah, there are always periods of chaos in between periods of sort of relative calm. And maybe right now is a time of relative chaos.
Mm,
I don't know if I've shared this whole backstory, but I had the privilege and honor of being one of California's 55 electors in the Electoral College. Long story how that came about, but basically a year ago this week, after the Biden-Harris ticket won, well, in most people's opinions, won,
mm,
then the Electoral College convened on, in early December in state houses all over the country and wrote out their little Electoral College votes. And then those votes went into a box and went to the Capitol, where on January 6th, the vice president, then Pence, was to ratify the Electoral College votes. And we all know what went down on January 6th. A lot of madness, and so that's
chaos.
some unprecedented chaos, and we're still living in the echo of that, the backwash of that today. And so that is just the reality of who we are and how we are now, and that doesn't have to be the end, right? It might just be, it always looks sort of darkest, right before dawn, and that kind of thing.
Mm,
So I don't want to ever be a Pollyanna and just like, it's going to be fine,
yeah, right.
because there is real suffering that's happening. And growing up a straight white guy like you did, it was, over the last, I would say 5 years, reading all the anti-racism books and learning what white privilege really means, and recognizing that, Oregon was certainly not safe from this. We all know that Oregon was settled largely by white supremacists, as was California. Their first order of business, the extermination of the indigenous
Yes.
people of California. And so this is the history. What strikes me is that one of the debates going on in society right now has to do with critical race theory, which
Yeah.
that's the buzz phrase for it. But
Yes.
anyway, the larger question, especially as an educator, is, what kind of history should we teach, at what grade level, what's age appropriate, and so on. And so you have, again, this false binary between all or nothing.
Yeah.
There are those on the right who just, I would put it this way, who just want to teach heritage. And there are those on the
Sure.
left who want to teach history. Now, heritage is, like, isn't America great? It's a place of freedom. Isn't the free market wonderful? And yes, there were slaves, but they actually were better off living under slavery, and all those kinds of things that to some
Yes.
of us are like, oh my God, are you really just literally writing that in a textbook? And then there are those of us who believe, we want reconciliation, but there has to be truth and reconciliation. So it seems like people on the left want to do, let's tell the truth, the whole 1619 project. And how you mentioned before about Epstein, and is it literally a conspiracy of particular people, or is it that institutions themselves have sort of submerged structures that were designed and created generations ago by people who are no longer alive? And then, because of genetic accident, I was born with this kind of body, and so I benefit from some of those structures.
Yes.
And I didn't earn that benefit. So that's what white privilege means. Maybe we should just call it unearned privilege. When I
Yeah,
go into
I like that.
CVS, yeah, when I go into CVS to buy a Band-Aid, I buy the ones called flesh colored, and flesh colored are this color.
Yeah,
You know, it's like that's how white centric the world is. You know, African Americans can't buy flesh colored Band-Aids. So that's a stupid, small, but kind of emblematic example of the way it's all just sort of baked in. And so that I am very interested in reading real history, and it doesn't make me feel guilty. The criticism against critical race theory is I don't want you to make my white kid feel guilty sitting in class learning about slavery, because white people look bad and black people look victimized. And I don't feel guilty because my black and African American friends, and I say it both ways because some of them like it one way, some of them like it the other. They tell me, don't feel guilty about slavery. You didn't do it.
right.
And Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of my favorite Jewish philosophers, puts it this way. He says, not all are guilty, but all are responsible.
Mm,
And I'm responsible in this sense that I ought to use my place in the world and my voice to be a part of the truth telling that comes before reconciliation. But people on the right who are against critical race theory or teaching racism, and ironically, their argument is if you teach about the history of racism, that's racist. I don't quite get that. But they want just the reconciliation without the truth telling. And when we look at the South African example, how they dug themselves out of apartheid, that they did it with truth and reconciliation commissions and very public truth telling. Just like after World War II, the new German chancellor, they immediately banned all Nazi regalia. Nazi flags are illegal in Germany. And the chancellor of Germany went to Auschwitz in like 1946, and he dropped to his knees and he wept. I mean, this is how nations can be redeemed. So Germany has had to reconcile with its past in a way that we in the United States never did.
yeah.
We have Confederate statues still all over the place, and generations of Black boys and girls had to attend elementary schools named after slave owners.
Mm, yeah. It's a very good, good point. And what I think about is what it makes me think about is, so I told you I do lives on TikTok where I talk about hard things sometimes. And I brought up critical race theory because I kept seeing this tendency of people who were either against it or for it.
Yeah.
And sometimes in either case, know nothing about it at all.
Right.
Never looked into it. And so I
Classic.
took it upon myself to go read about it because I'm like, all right, well, this is again being a quasi philosopher, an armchair or a couch
No, I get it.
philosopher. I want to understand, because these, again, we got to talk about these things if we're going to get through them. And this is what's missing, is people doing that. And so I go read about it and I'm like, well, this doesn't sound like what people say it is. Like I could
Shocker.
see, yeah, I could see how somebody would make the argument that this is this or this isn't this. And so then for me, even after reading it, I would need to be in a class. I would need to
Yes.
take the class to fully understand it. And I
Oh, yeah.
think that people take this stuff, even if they read what I read, they can take it out of context. And so, I go live on TikTok and I'm asking people about it. And, obviously, I see it teaches, white people are racist. I'm like, okay, where did you hear that? Where did you read that? Point me in a direction, show me some source that says specifically that white people are racist. And what I came back with is that it's not about all white people being racist, but is it possible that you have a racist bias and you're unaware of it? Because we certainly do. It's possible because that's the way we grew up, right? And I like what you said there, is that it's not your fault, but you're responsible. And I believe that, because that is a virtue, right? This whole conversation is based in virtues, right? It is our responsibility to take it is our responsibility to look at these things.
I think
And
so.
if we're not making them better, then we're not doing our job, right? Just like macrocosm, microcosm.
Yeah.
Microcosm, make yourself better. Macrocosm, make the world better.
Right.
And I find it hard for people to sit here and say that there isn't some kind of either racist tendencies or racist bias. It just it is, it's not arguable. There is, but that doesn't mean that everybody that lives in this country is racist.
It
It
is
just means
bad.
it
Yeah.
means we got to clean it up. Like we just got to clean it up. We just got to make some things a little bit more fair for everybody, like just as much as it is a race thing, you could argue that there's a wealth, bias,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Ooh, yes, class.
yeah, classes, right? Like that's a problem. We need to
Yeah.
fix that too. Um, it
Well,
doesn't
look,
have to be
you and
painful.
I,
Go ahead.
yeah, well, because you and I are interested in exploring these things kind of on an intellectual level. I enjoy learning things I didn't know yesterday. I
Yeah.
kind of like dig that, So it's like, oh my God, I didn't know what black codes were, Google black codes. And, one of my black friends told me to do that. And this is like 3 years ago. And I Google it. I'd never heard of it. And this is a conversation going around the dinner table in every black home in America. They learn about it at an early age, what black codes were. And I won't go down the whole road here, but it's all these very restrictive policies that sprung up right after the end of the Civil War. But my larger point would be, yeah, I enjoy learning about things like that, even though it is overwhelming and painful. And when you watch Ava DuVernay's film 13th on Netflix about the 13th Amendment and about how we got from that to mass incarceration. It is jaw-dropping, and it is not a feel-good movie. You come out of that kind of sick to your stomach, but knowing more about American history, about how it was really shaped. And the reason there are no black people in this neighborhood is because there were racist codes just 30 years ago that prevented, this is in Southern California, that prevented Jews and African Americans from buying property here. And there was a silent agreement between all the realtors to keep the property levels up. So segregation is a system that was created by people, not you and me, but it was created by people that we now inherit. So there is just one of the things that makes discussing race so difficult is, and Robin DiAngelo points this out in her book, and now the title's escaping me, Robin DiAngelo, it'll come to me later. I think it's called White Privilege, maybe. But she notes this, that racism has become unpopular. When Brown versus Board of Education, when segregation became illegal, when Jim Crow ended in the civil rights movement in the early 60s, it became socially unacceptable to be racist. Before then, among white people, racism was completely explicit and open. Colored drinking fountains, white drinking fountains. Everybody was like, okay, that's the world. But after the 60s, it became socially unacceptable to be blatantly racist. So it kind of went underground. And then to be racist became so socially damaging that when you ask people on surveys, being called a racist is actually worse than being called a pedophile. In other words, DiAngelo's making the case that we kind of made a misstep when we demonized racist consciousness, because now people will defend. It's like, I'm not racist. I didn't mean that to be racist. Now people defend themselves against that charge, and it stops all discussions about racism because now nobody's racist. And so the problem just sort of, quote unquote, vanished. And it makes it difficult for us to just talk about our own implicit bias. When I do workshops on anti-racism, I always start with vulnerable kind of self-confession stories. I talk about my own biases and how I came to be aware of them, and how I worked hard to undo them. And I think, racism is not something white people do to non-white people. It's we all animals, all biological biological beings discriminate against people, against creatures that don't look like them. That's a biological sort of baseline that's happening. And so starting there and just recognizing that and going, yeah, but that's not how we want to live now. We want to live in a place where we recognize our underlying humanity, as the ancient Greeks did when they talked about our psyche, But guess what? Aristotle was pro-slavery. So,
Fascinating. I didn't know that.
he argued that some races are the naturally inferior slaves of other races.
Wow.
It's horrific. And so people are complicated, aren't they?
Yes.
And, the pro-slavery Civil War South, before the war, voices on the floor of Congress quoted Aristotle. They quoted scripture about the righteousness of slavery. So there is in us for millennia this what we are now realizing is destructive ideology and destructive consciousness. And there's almost a religious quality to white supremacy. People flock to those ideologies, or other kinds of extreme groups, because they want to belong to something. They're looking for some kind of certainty. They're not comfortable with uncertainty. So here's a ideology that explains everything to you, and people kind of need that. Again, it goes back to how we started.
Meaning.
Meaning. We want answers, damn it.
Yeah.
We want things to make sense in this crazy mess that we're in. And so some people, I used the word lazy before, maybe that was a little harsh, but doing the work is exhausting.
Yes.
And I understand why people just look for easy off ramps into ideologies that sort of explain everything, with their group being on the top.
Yes. Yeah, certainly. And you mentioned it before. A great example of that is Hitler and the Nazis, right? This idea of the Aryans, right? Whether, and that has always been, that whole thing has always been fascinating to me, because I've never really understood it. Being a student of history, I've very much wanted to understand, what was it about the Jewish people that Hitler and his leadership hated so much? I really still, and I've tried to look this up, and I really just don't understand it. What's even more fascinating, maybe fascinating is not the right word, troubling, concerning, is that he convinced a whole country to believe that. And this is what I talk about. This is why psychology is important, right? Like I kind of have this, I try to take this well-rounded approach to understanding things, which is through philosophy, history, archaeology, anthropology, and psychology, because they all matter.
Good. Yeah.
And what I've come to understand is that, when you look at Hitler and Aryans and, their kind of quasi interest with the supernatural and trying to trace their heritage to these supermen, the Aryans. But what does that have to do with the Jewish people, right? And it's like, why was it just the Jew? Well, maybe it wasn't, but it seems at least their target, their primary target was the Jewish people. And I don't get that. I really don't understand what the hate was there and why they were targeted so much. I don't know if maybe or if you could shed some light on that.
Anti-Semitism is not a German thing, right? There's just as many anti-Semites in all the countries that the Nazis conquered,
right.
In Holland, in France, in Sweden, everywhere else, Italy. So it's an ancient thing, and no, I can't explain it, but we can just simply notice that the Jews were excluded from society. They only make up 1% of the population of the planet. And so wherever they were after the Roman diaspora in 70 CE, they scattered around the world. They were always minority communities, and exploited and oppressed by the dominant culture, forbidden from owning property. And forbidden from working in most honorable employment. So they were only allowed to do, in some cultures, work that the dominant culture deemed sinful, namely money lending, dealing in jewels. So over the centuries, in many of the countries of the diaspora, Jewish culture centered around, says, we can't own land, let's deal in jewels, let's deal in furs, let's, portable wealth. And then they began to be hated for what the culture had forced them into. And so it's this scapegoating thing, which ironically comes from Hebrew scripture, right? From
Mm,
Leviticus. The
yes.
idea of let's dump all the sins on this goat and send it out into the desert to die as a way of us atoning for our flaws. And so Hitler is the master scapegoater. And I won't name any other names of prominent recent political leaders who are really good at pointing out, let's just not let any Muslims in the country, because every Muslim, as we know, according to Marjorie Taylor Greene, is a terrorist and wants to kill us all. So, this is scapegoating 101. It's classic propaganda. And it's again kind of intellectually, cognitively false, but something in us is easily convinced that these narratives have power. So I can't explain why the Jews once again were targeted by the Nazis. There's a long history of anti-Semitism in Europe that they just tapped into and exploited, and they didn't have to do much. It's like you just have to one more little tip, one more touch, and society will tip in that horrible
Yeah.
direction.
Yes.
And so that's the back to the fear. That's the frightening part of it. Any free society like ours is in constant danger of that kind of tipping into something that is evil and
Tyrannical.
and authoritarian and tyrannical. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. I very much get concerned about our country and moving into that direction. A lot of people don't want to talk about that, and a lot of people are like, no, that's just, I don't know, you could call it any number of things, but I do get concerned about that. It doesn't matter if you're left or right, because either way, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not about being left or right, it's about being extreme right and extreme left.
Yeah.
And what I get concerned with is that these extreme ideas don't represent a true free society.
Yeah.
And I get concerned about what that looks like and the directions that we're heading. It's very concerning, and it's just like it's so crazy because I go back to the 90s, and obviously as a kid I was a little bit, unaware of like things going on, but
Of
at
course.
least
We all were.
in the 90s as a kid, things
Yeah.
in life seemed pretty great, for me. And now being today, and it's probably a combination of my own delusions and being having a fully developed brain and being plugged into society now.
Hmm.
I worry about this. I do worry about the people who run things, because we've been talking about some people, right?
Yeah.
The Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Ted Cruz, the Andrew Cuomo's,
Yeah.
you know, uh,
Power corrupts, it doesn't
yeah,
matter if there's an R or a D next to your name, people get into trouble when they're given all that money and power. And that's an ancient truth as well. So
yes,
to me, action is the antidote. Action is the medicine. I have some simple things that I try to do. I subscribe to local newspaper wherever I live. I think print media and electronic media on a local level is crucial. As national media gets increasingly corporatized, where are the real journalists doing the real work? Let's support them.
yes.
That's an engine of our freedom, just as trial attorneys are. I know we like to crap all over attorneys until you get arrested. and then
Yeah,
suddenly an attorney fighting for your rights in court is the greatest thing ever. So I always am a big fan of innocent until proven guilty, and the process, as flawed as it is. Sometimes trials don't turn out the way we would think they should, and sometimes
right.
they do. But the system, it's like what Churchill said about democracy. It's a terrible form of government, but it's better than all the others.
That's true. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I often wonder, when because I've had discussions with other people. There seems to be, I don't know if you have an opinion on it. There seems to be a trend among young people to be in favor of communism and socialism. And I get it. I see the interest. I know, and I think that again, kind of like we talked about critical race theory, I think it's
Yeah.
because some people don't have all the information. And my argument has always been people who are in favor of communist countries have never lived in a communist country.
Yeah.
Just read
Fair.
the Gulag or
Oh
the Gulag
God. Yeah.
archipelago.
Right.
Horrible
I think
atrocities.
I think when people express favorable opinions about socialism, they're thinking about Iceland, not
Yes,
Stalinist Russia. They're thinking about, can
yes.
I just please have a basic income so I'm not homeless?
Yes. And so then the question is there hope, or is there maybe something to be said about the idea of like a capitalist socialist government?
I hope
Like,
so. Well,
you know
we're
what I mean?
living in one. We're
True.
that's what we have. We're not socialist or communist because the government doesn't own industries. That's the first thing that happens in communism. Everything, there's no more private ownership of anything.
Right.
Railways, the oil industry, it's all owned by the state. So we don't have anything like that. So we aren't a socialist country, but we
Right.
have minimum wage, we have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have a sort of, in my opinion, not enough of a social foundation. I think we should have some kind of, we're the only country left without decent public health care. So there are things we could do better.
Yes.
But I think that's what people mean, especially young people today coming out of college, and look at how much rent is,
I know. Oh God.
and they're
Yeah.
like, man, I'm never gonna be able to make it in this crazy world. So the very inequities of capitalism are driving people into the arms of different adjustments in capitalism toward the German model, the Dutch model, the Danish model, where education is more affordable. You don't come out of college with $200,000 of debt.
Yeah.
These are, I think we can all agree, this is, well, obviously we can't all agree, but
Right.
many of us feel that it's, if the Constitution says I have the right to life, then an extension of that is the right to be healthy. And
Yeah.
there ought to be some sort of assistance in terms of healthcare, like everybody else does except us.
Well, you brought up the Constitution, the right, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lots of people in America are not happy right now. Right.
Well, you can pursue it. You don't have the right to get happy.
Oh yeah. Oh, even that's deep. That's good. But it doesn't have to be so hard. I feel like it's hard. And then, then that leads into the kind of like what we talked about earlier with, is that on purpose, or is that just a flaw of the system that we're in? Yeah, so many things there. I feel like that's a whole nother podcast too. But
maybe.
okay. So to wrap things up here, I guess I'm going to end with a two-part question. First part question. What do you think the philosophers of ancient Greece, if they were alive today and they were debating in the halls of Congress today, what do you think are, two key points that they would bring up? What do you think that they would say about our society the way it is? Do you think they would have any suggestions on how to make it better?
Oh my goodness, that's a wonderful question. I think they would say, wow, not much has changed.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hold up the ancient Greeks as some kind of ideal, as
Right.
society. There's some sort of utopia that we need to aspire to. It was horribly racist and classist and sexist and all those isms. However, there are, in some of the writings of a few of the philosophers, there are some profoundly important nuggets about how we might repair and move our societies increasingly toward justice, just as their best voices were trying to move them increasingly toward justice.
Right.
So I don't know what they would say. I think they would marvel, and they would also recognize the architecture. They would go, looking around Washington, they go, hey, look at all these Greek columns. This is cool.
Yes.
Thank you. So there's clearly in the architecture of Washington, D.C. and San Diego County Courthouse, and wherever you live, there's probably Greek columns and stuff.
Oh, yes.
We have a sort of, again, that structural cultural heritage, that the rational ideal is still something that we want to aspire to, the rule of law, the rule of reason, that every human being, regardless, and we've expanded it now, regardless of class or race or gender or sexual orientation, that every human being has innate rational capacity and ought to be trusted. That's what the jury system is. You just grab 12 people off the bus and you stick them in seats and you go, you guys figure it out. That's a lot of faith in rational discourse
Mm.
and in our public education system. So I think they would recognize some of their ideals are still being experimented with. But, I think they would be overwhelmed.
Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah. Okay. And then the part two to that question, to wrap this up, what do you think our society needs, right? If you had the ability, right? If you were president, Peter Bolland for president, maybe.
Oh, God.
Um,
We were having so much fun, and then you had to go do that.
what what are some things you think could be helpful to our society going from an acorn to a giant tree?
Well, look, part of me wants to go down my political checklist and pass
Yes.
all the laws that I want to pass, but that's probably not the intention of the question. And besides, I don't think I'm right about everything. And if I just had my way, everything would, utopia would burst out. I
Yeah.
think I'm humble enough to realize that's not the case. But, I don't know what I could do in the office of the presidency that would make much of a difference. Let's be real. Presidents are kind of figureheads. We almost don't even have them, right? Washington hated the idea and they just barely talked him into it. He's like, it's too much like a king. Can't we just have Congress and the courts? But somebody got it through the Constitution that no, we need to have this chief executive and he'll just do a couple things. He'll be the commander in chief and he'll sign stuff ceremoniously, but not much power. But as we've all seen during our lifetimes, the presidency's powers have expanded greatly under Obama and under Trump as well. So now the president really is a kind of powerful political force in the country, not just as a figurehead. But I think the essence of your question is a rich one, which is, what do I think needs to kind of shift? I think what you and I can do, what ordinary people can do, is what we've been talking about this last hour. When you come upon something that's uncomfortable and contentious, like whether it's critical race theory or socialism versus capitalism or whatever it is, or racism itself, be humble like Socrates and say, I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm going to learn more. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to read and not just not just watch YouTube videos, because that's just guys like you and me talking,
Yeah.
which is cool, especially our videos. But I mean, but you never know what you're going to get there. I'm talking about peer-reviewed,
Yes.
scholarly work that comes out of the best thinking in that field. And expertise is a real thing and we should respect it. It doesn't mean it's to be obeyed blindly, but it's the best responses. And so learn more, being humble and get together with your neighbors again as soon as COVID continues to fade a little further. Let's start barbecuing together again, and let's put away our political hats and meet each other on the street, in the park, at church, in synagogue, wherever we gather around our shared interests. And let's try to understand each other. Not everybody who owns a gun is a crazed gun zealot, obviously. I'm a Second Amendment guy. I think gun ownership is baked into who we are in the United States. But it's troubling, when you see some of the unwillingness to even have the simplest regulations. If my dog bites somebody, that dog gets registered and all kinds of paperwork and records are kept. I can't buy ibuprofen at CVS without showing my driver's license, in case I'm cooking meth with the raw ingredients or something. So I don't know why guns need to be so completely unregulated. Actually, I do know the argument why that is made by some people, but those people don't represent 80% of gun owners in this country who are for background checks and universal background checks. So I know that there's a fundamental rational, most people kind of want the same things. And it's like you said earlier, the extreme voices, they're the loudest.
Yes. Mm.
John Shelby Spong, the great recently deceased Anglican bishop or Episcopalian bishop, put it this way: he says, society is like the swimming pool. All the noise is coming from the shallow end.
Mm. Mm.
And we need to keep, guys like you were trying to do this, we need to keep bringing people into the deep end and start to feel the nuance. And we just get up every morning and do the work that we do. And we hope that more and more people start to frame their own lives a little differently, a little more compassionately. That's I think what we can do. And that's an inside job. It's not going to come from the legislative branch.
Yeah, I agree. And I have hope. We survived this long as a race of human beings. And just like our physiological evolution, our ideas, our beliefs, our governments, it's all an evolution. We are making fundamental mistakes so that we can learn from them, right? We have done things in our past that are terrible and unexcusable. But what we now know is that when we do things like that, or allow ourselves to become a society that accepts these doctrines or whatever, that there are consequences, right? Every action has a consequence. So what actions are we going to allow ourselves to make in the future, whether it's, again, macrocosm, microcosm,
Yeah. I think it's in
down
our
to our
wisdom
little level as
tradition.
us as individuals? Yes. Our virtues, right? Are we
Right.
going to, what virtues are we going to stand on, if any at all? But making these mistakes is allowing us to evolve. And if we could all collectively see that, it would, again, bring us to that Taoism, right? Like a religion that is not about a deity, but a religion that is a respect among human beings, because we are all a piece of this nature, this thing that we are together. And that's my TED talk. Peter, thanks for being here.
Thank you,
I
Ken.
love talking to you. We'll
Same here.
definitely bring you on again.
Good.
But yeah, this has been great. Again, I'll reach out to you about doing this again. For everybody else that's listening, Peter Bolland, you can find his YouTube channel by searching his name, and you can find him on social media by also searching his name. And I would encourage you to go watch his YouTube videos, because he does break down some very interesting ideas about religion, and talks about it in a way that is relatable to everybody.
Right
So
on.
again, yeah, thank you again. Everybody else, we'll catch you later. This has been Hermit Radio, and I hope you enjoy. We'll catch you next time.